Okay, boys, so this is just a wee bit of a follow-up to the video I did a day or two ago regarding the trigger pulse that's present on the coil and plug assembly in order to initiate ignition from the assembly itself. So the trigger pulse is obviously there in order to control the coil with respect to it charging and discharging, or turning on the igniter within the solid state switch within the coil and plug assembly, and allowing the primary coil to charge, and then at the applicable time turning it off. And of course, the collapse in the primary induces a high voltage in the secondary. Okay, so that's the basics, of course, right? So we were looking at the trigger, and keep in mind, yesterday I was actually talking about this value here, because the whole point to the video yesterday is, of course, can you effectively troubleshoot a trigger with just a digital multimeter. Tricky, of course, because it's such a narrow pulse. You're only going to see a minimal voltage on your DMM. So I got into discussions after the fact, quite late that evening, in the comment section with Denny, and I come to the realization that I was under a few misconceptions. Denny being, of course, Gadgets Playlist Denis, formerly the Logical Canuck, referred to as the Logical Canuck for good reason. He knows what the hell he's talking about. It's just a shame I wasn't Denny's neighbor 30 years ago. I could have learned a great deal from him, I'm telling you. So we got into some discussions, and I come to the realization that discussing duty cycle when you're talking about a pulse, a trigger, the trigger pulse width, which affects the dwell of the coil, is probably no good idea. I'm kind of mixing terms, if you will, boys, but realize I was only referring to duty cycle with respect to correcting the voltage that we were actually seeing. The idea being we could actually consider the pulse width with respect to its duty cycle over the grand scheme of things, and apply that correction to the 5 volts and end up with close to what we actually had on the meter. So what I've got here tonight, boys, is just the same setup, and I want to see for myself, is the pulse width going to change much? Not the duty cycle, because of course the duty cycle will change as the RPM sweeps over the range. Of course there's going to be more pulses per second, so the duty cycle is of course going to change as we sweep over the RPM range. But is the pulse width itself actually going to change? I don't think it will. I think we'll see a wide pulse width at the initial start of the vehicle, and if the vehicle was under some loads, perhaps the ECM would widen the pulse or the dwell in order to cope with that a wee bit. That may or may not be a strategy that it has. I think it may be, but I'm not sure about that. But the only point to the video this evening is look at the pulse width, sweep it over the RPM range to some degree. We'll let it idle. We'll double that figure. So the idle is about 650-ish, a wee bit higher, I guess, at this temperature. I've had the car running, so based on the current engine coolant temperature, I think it's going to try and attain the idle of about 682. So we'll double that to just over 1300. It's a wee bit tricky with an electronic throttle to hold a stable RPM, and then I'll elevate it a wee bit higher. You'll hear it in the background anyway, boys. I'll try and make it fairly quick, so it's no boring the hell out of you. But yeah, so hopefully you can see this. The one that's in orange is the actual engine RPM, and the desired idle is the one, the figure below that, currently reading 690. And I think you can quite clearly see the scope on the telly there behind you. So without further ado, let me open the garage door and we'll start the vehicle. So here's a tip for you fellas. Never, and I mean never, disagree with Denny. He is a gentleman. He will let you state your case and then very politely explain to you why you're incorrect in your assumptions about something. So Denny, thank you very much for the discussion that you engaged in very, very late. I think I might have kept you up last night. I do appreciate you clarifying a few things that I was under a misconception about. Greatly appreciated. I hope this video actually serves a purpose, because it is mainly for me, to be quite honest, boys. But I think it's important that you realize last night, again, the discussion with respect to duty cycle was with only a correction on the number that was in the upper left-hand corner. And interestingly, you could see the dwell significantly wider for a short period of time just as the vehicle actually starts. I guess engine stabilization makes some sense, right? Okay, so that's it, boys. I hope that made some sense. Cheers. Thanks again, Denny.